Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. In this video, we're going to be going over some of the internal anatomy of the brain, some of the internal brain structures, at least the limited number that we can see on our models. We'll be bouncing between page 32 and 33 on the list of things to know. If you're watching these videos, you know they're intended for my students, the students that are enrolled in my course. But if anyone out there in YouTube land finds them helpful, by all means, please hit like and subscribe, or at least like, so that I know that my videos are helpful and I can keep making them. And I'm going to try to pretty them up in the future. Now, I have two brains here. One is upside down, one is not. We call this the puzzle brain. It's the 3D one. This is the brain on a half shell because it comes in half. I'm going to start with this model and start showing you some of the anatomy of the internal structures of the brain. So, I'm only going to use half the brain. When we break it open, if you were to slice through the brain, the knife would actually run through the longitudinal fissure a certain distance, and then it would hit the corpus callosum from on top. So I'm going to open this one up for a second, and you can see, if I tilt it just a little bit, the two hemispheres are separated by a big gap called the longitudinal fissure, and you could literally stick something down there and touch the corpus callosum. Okay? So now, if I slice through the corpus callosum, I'm going to get a lot of these other structures. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to zoom in on this so that you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. So you're not going to see me or my face, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay? So give me just a second. Let me get my camera going, so that you guys are all nice and zoomed in and you can see all the structures. Again, you're not going to see me in this video mostly. You're going to hear my voice, but I got a face made for radio. So now obviously all of this up here would be cerebrum. This would be the medulla. This would be the pons, this little structure here. This is our cerebellum. You can see the white tree-like structure inside the cerebellum called the arbor vitae. Now the first thing we hit is this large arching structure here, which is called the corpus callosum. Now the corpus callosum, as I said before, is a bridge from the front of the brain to the back and side to side. Now the corpus callosum is sitting above an empty space. So look, if I took my two hands like this and made an empty chamber, if I was looking from the front of the brain and we sliced the front off, then I would see this empty chamber in the middle of the brain. If I put a piece of paper across there, they would be separated by a little membrane. I would still have all of this empty space and all of this empty space. Those are called the lateral ventricles. The membrane that separates them is called the septum pellucidum. Pel means almost in Latin, and lucid means clear. This little membrane right here is so thin you can almost see through it. So they call it the septum pellucidum, septum meaning a divider. So this is the corpus callosum, this is the septum pellucidum, and then this little white arching structure just below it is called the fornix. So corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, fornix. Corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, and fornix. And the way to learn this stuff is to repeat it, 3 or 4 things at a time. Then I have medulla, pons, and the cerebellum with the arbor vitae. Now, if you look carefully, if I sliced right above the pons across here and right above the rest of this stuff, some people refer to this as a duck's head, because this would be the nice crown of feathers on the top of the duck. This would be the main part of the head with an eyeball. This would be the duck's beak, and it's biting onto a little stick with this hanging off. This would be the neck of the duck, okay? Well, this little neck area is called the midbrain. It's one of our major brain regions. Medulla, pons, and then just this section is called the midbrain. Now, if I go above this, all of this up here, from the midbrain to the fornix, including all of this, is called the diencephalon. Now, the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, and the fornix are sitting kind of on top of the diencephalon. The major structure in the middle of the diencephalon is this thing right here, which is called the thalamus. This little almond-shaped structure is called the thalamus. Now, it's a little bit hard to see, but once again, if I took my two hands like this and I made a mass on either side and I stuck them together and joined them at this knuckle, then you can see some space kind of in front of my fingers, underneath, and even up here above. It would go all the way around in 3 dimensions. If I break it in half and turn it, you don't really see this space. You're seeing the rest of my fist, but this knuckle sticks out. Well, this thalamus would be the fist, and that little dot, that little gold dot in the middle would be my knuckle where the two halves are joined. Our thalamus is mostly separated, and they touch each other at a structure called the interthalamic adhesion. And then some people call it the intermediate mass. And then some books call it the massa intermedia, which is Latin for intermediate mass. So you can call that little gold dot, if I ask for it, the interthalamic adhesion, the massa intermedia, or the intermediate mass. I will accept any of the 3 names. That's where the two halves of the thalamus meet and join. This area below that is called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus because it's below the thalamus. Got it? So let's run through real quick. Up here we have cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, we have the pons, and the medulla. This little area that looks like the head of a duck is the diencephalon. Between the top edge of the pons and the diencephalon, this area is the midbrain. Above the diencephalon, we have the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, and the fornix. The middle part of the diencephalon, the major structure here, is the thalamus, and the little gold dot would be called the intermediate mass. And then this little flesh-colored area coming down here, which would be sort of the bill of the duck, is called the hypothalamus. Now, it's biting on this little white dot. When you learn the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, one of the things you're going to learn is this. If you look at my fingers, this nerve is going to go to one eyeball, this nerve is going to go to another eyeball, and they crisscross. Those nerves, since they go to the eyeball, are going to be called the optic nerves. Where the optic nerves form a little X is called the optic chiasm, and it's really right where they meet. If I could slice right down the middle of this and turn it, what I would be seeing is that little white dot right there. That little white spot is called the optic chiasm. It's on your list, and it looks like the word optic chiasm, but it's pronounced optic chiasm. Chi is the Greek letter X. There's a little tiny stem hanging from the optic chiasm to this little meatball. That stem is called the infundibulum. It connects this structure called the pituitary gland, the pituitary, or also called the hypophysis. So pituitary gland, pituitary, or hypophysis, they're all the same thing. The hypophysis or pituitary is connected to the optic chiasm and the rest of the brain by that little tiny stem there called the infundibulum. Now, if this is the pituitary gland, then way back here, this little pink stripe ends in a little tiny meatball back here, and that is going to be called the, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Where the superior colliculus, the pineal gland, I'm sorry, the pituitary gland, and then the pineal gland is this little red mass right here. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but just below the pineal gland, there are 2 bumps right here. The top bump is called a superior colliculus. The bottom bump is called an inferior colliculus. Again, these words are on your list, so have it handy. So I have the pineal gland, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Now, the superior and the inferior colliculus are the back part of the midbrain. Now, one of the things we're going to learn on another model, but I'm going to cover it here, is what we call the ventricles of the brain, the empty chambers. I got a ventricle here on this side of the septum pellucidum. If I could poke through the septum pellucidum, there would be a ventricle on the other side. Since there's 2 ventricles on the side, they're called lateral ventricles. We tend not to ask it on this model. They're going to drain through a little tiny opening here into this area that surrounds the middle of the thalamus and runs through the hypothalamus, which would be where we find what we call the 3rd ventricle. And then the 3rd ventricle is going to drain through this little groove right here called the cerebral aqueduct, also called the mesencephalic aqueduct, also called the aqueduct of Sylvius, from the guy who first described it. Now, prosencephalon would be forebrain, hindencephalon would be the back of the brain, the brain stem, The diencephalon's in here. The midbrain is sometimes called the mesencephalon. Meso means middle, and so that's the mesencephalic aqueduct, that little groove, also called the cerebral aqueduct, also called the aqueduct of Sylvius. I don't care which name you choose. The fluid in the lateral ventricles will drain through the third ventricle, then run through the cerebral aqueduct into this chamber. This little space at the base of the of the cerebellum is called the fourth ventricle. So on this model, we tend to like to ask, what is the groove here? That would be your cerebral aqueduct, and that would be the fourth ventricle. The other two ventricles are better seen on another model. So now that's quite a bit of stuff. Let's run through it one more time. I have the cerebrum up here. I have the cerebellum with its arbor vitae, and I can even see the folia in it. I have the medulla and the pons and the midbrain. All of this duck head looking thing would be the diencephalon. This arch is the corpus callosum. The membrane connecting the arches is called the septum pellucidum. And then this little arch would be called the fornix. This round or oval mass right here is called the thalamus. The little dot in the center is called the intermediate mass. Down here would be called the hypothalamus. Now, the white spot is called the optic chiasm. The little stem is called the infundibulum. And the red meatball is called the pituitary gland. Optic chiasm, infundibulum, pituitary gland. Now, if I go to the back over here, this little red spot at the end is called the pineal gland, and then I have two bumps, a superior and an inferior colliculus. I have the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle. Now, we have the other half of the brain. The only difference is it's facing the opposite direction, and they missed the infundibulum and pituitary, but all of the structures would be the same. Corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, fornix, thalamus, intermediate mass, hypothalamus. I get a very good view of the optic chiasm. The infundibulum would be there. The pituitary is missing. There's a little mass right here called a mammillary body. It's very hard to see. I'll show you on another model. I have the thalamus, the optic chiasm, the hypothalamus. I have the thalamus, the intermediate mass, the hypothalamus, optic chiasm, infundibulum. We're missing the pituitary here, but there's the pineal gland, that little red meatball. And there's a superior and an inferior colliculus. I have the cerebral aqueduct, the fourth ventricle. Pons, medulla, midbrain, cerebellum with the arbor vitae. Finally, I'm going to go to our puzzle brain. We're going to take the cerebellum and remove it. You can see again the vermis and the folia and the two cerebellar hemispheres. The vermis is also visible on the bottom. I'm going to get rid of that. If I break the two top parts of the brain of the cerebrum off, I can look underneath and see some white matter and some gray matter. The gray matter, that layer, is called the cerebral cortex. I also see it from this view. And I'm going to face this to where he's facing up at the ceiling. You can see the cerebral cortex on the edge. The type of tissue there would be called gray matter. The type of tissue here would be called white matter. This is our corpus callosum going from front to back. If I pop the corpus callosum off, this little light yellow arch right here coming back is called the fornix. We don't see the septum pellucidum on this model, but that would be the fornix. Since the corpus callosum would be above this, there would be a membrane right down the middle here separating it, called the septum pellucidum. That would give me this big empty space and this big empty space that goes from here all the way here. Those empty spaces are called the lateral ventricles. So you can see a good view of the fornix there. Now I'm going to remove part of the frontal lobe. I'm going to pull this out of the temporal and occipital lobes, and I'm going to get down to what we call the brainstem and diencephalon. I have the medulla here. I have the pons here. This white area up here would be called the midbrain. And then all of this is called the diencephalon. They called it that because di means two and cephalon means head or inside the head. And I have this mass and this mass. Most of this mass across here is the thalamus, and it's massive up here. It runs across and connects to this one and makes another thalamus. Now, on the outer edge here, I see this series of folds that looks like cerebral cortex. It has gyri and sulci. This little piece right here on either side is called the insula, or the insula of Rayleigh. So this series of folds is called the insula. Now, when I point to this, people think I'm pointing to the whole thing, and I'm not. I'm just pointing to this outer edge. The beauty of our puzzle brain is, on one side, they have it to where I can remove the insula. Underneath it is this red bean-shaped structure. A lentil is a type of bean, so this is called the lentiform nucleus, or it's also called the putamen, or some people pronounce it putamen. So this is the putamen or lentiform nucleus. This white area that surrounds it is called the internal capsule because it encapsulates all of that. And then what covers it is this thin layer called the insula. If I peel the insula off, underneath would be the putamen, and then I have the internal capsule. On the other side, if I peeled the insula off, there would be a putamen and an internal capsule. Now, if I look down on top of it this way, I can see the putamen, I can see the top edge of the internal capsule. This red structure that wraps all the way underneath is called the caudate nucleus. That's your caudate nucleus, all the way around. Cauda means tail, it has a tail that tucks underneath. I can see the caudate nucleus over here as well. Everything in the middle, even including these two big lobes hanging off, is all part of our thalamus. And I can see it from the front connecting right here. Now, on the back side of the thalamus, this little meatball in the middle would be called the pineal gland. This model is missing a pituitary gland, but it does have the pineal gland. This top bump is called a superior colliculus. This bottom bump is called an inferior colliculus. And I have two superior and two inferior. Collectively, all four are called the corpora quadrigemina. Quadra means four, Gemini means twins, and corpora means bodies in plural. So that's your corpora quadrigemina. Two superior colliculi, two inferior colliculi. And of course, this big gap back here would be where the fourth ventricle is. So I have the insula. If I peel it off, I get to the putamen, the internal capsule, and the caudate nucleus. Everything across the middle here is all thalamus. That's the pineal gland, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, collectively the corpora quadrigemina. If I flip it around to the front, I see the medulla, I see the pons, and all of this is the midbrain, and those two little green dots would be called the mammillary bodies. This is your two optic nerves. They make this X here called the optic chiasm. That little white spot where the hole is called the infundibulum. It's where the pituitary was connected. And there's the two mammillary bodies. One of the things we remembered as students is O, optic chiasm, I, infundibulum, am a mammal. There's two mammillary bodies, the two little green dots. Now, if I break this open, this is this. The only difference is one is missing this infundibulum and the pituitary, and it's missing the corpus callosum, the fornix, the septum pellucidum. So here you see the corpus callosum and the fornix. Here I only see the fornix. This little red stripe is where the fornix would be. This would be the thalamus. That would be the intermediate mass. This would be the hypothalamus. There's an optic nerve. So that's the optic chiasm, the infundibulum, and the mammillary body. Here I see the pons and the medulla oblongata, and here I see the superior and inferior colliculus. That groove is the cerebral aqueduct. This is where the fourth ventricle would be. Now that's quite a bit of anatomy, and the only way you're going to get it is if you do it. So you have to print all of these pictures, and you have to start practicing labeling them until you can label them from memory. But you should be able to grab a brain model or grab a picture and say, this is all cortex, corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, fornix, thalamus, intermediate mass, hypothalamus, optic chiasm, infundibulum, pituitary, pineal gland, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus. Here I have the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. I have the cerebellum with the beautiful arbor vitae. There's the cerebral aqueduct and the fourth ventricle. On this model, you should be able to pick it up and say, this is the medulla, this is the pons, this is the midbrain. There's the two mammillary bodies, this is the optic nerves and the optic chiasm where they meet, and that's the infundibulum. I have the insula, putamen, internal capsule, and the red on the other side is the caudate nucleus. All of this in the middle would be thalamus. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned something. This stuff is really hard to teach and learn sort of in an online setting. Usually what happens when I'm teaching in a classroom is I have every student with the model in their hands and we go over it. They can see it and touch it and feel it. So print the pictures, download the images of the brain models, the brain pictures, print them, put them in a clear sheet, practice labeling them. If you can't get them all, that's okay. Do just 4 and do them in the same order. Till you can't stand it, erase it, do it again, erase it, use a dry erase marker, do it again, erase it, do it again, erase it, till you can do it from memory. The first time you're going to cheat and look at your list. Second time you do a little less cheating until you don't have to cheat anymore. Okay? It's the only way to learn all this stuff. We have quite a few more brain structures and spinal cord structures going. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.